Hey, hello, and good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Berry, and I'm the Research Coordinator and Lab Manager for the University of Georgia Honeybee Lab. And I'm here to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, and that's pollination. Next slide, please. So what is pollination? Well, pollination is simply the movement of pollen from one flower to the next, and pollinators are anything that is going to move that pollen. Flowers, see, they attract pollinators by offering delicious and nutritious nectar. And once the pollinator lands or hovers near a flower, that pollen from that flower becomes adhered to the body and then is transferred when the pollinator visits the next flower. Next slide, please. So who are our pollination players? Next slide. Well, my favorites are the bees, and there's thousands of different species of bees. For example, we have sweat bees, we have carpenter bees, we have bumblebees, we have honeybees, my favorite. Next slide. Other pollinators are going to include moths and butterflies like monarchs and swallowtails and lutemoths. Next slide, please. And we also have some of the not so popular ones, but our wasps. But wasps are actually pollinators too. When they stop to visit a flower to sip on nectar, they can move pollen as well. Next slide, please. We also have flies. Oh gosh, tons of different types of flower flies that mimic bees and wasps, but they too are great little pollinators. Next slide. And how about those beautiful hummingbirds as they're flying from flower to flower? They are pollinating as well. Next slide. And then our nighttime pollinators are bats. As they move from flower to flower, they are doing great pollination services. Next slide. Now, why are bees such great pollinators? Well, they need that nectar and that pollen. It's their food. Nectar is their carbohydrate source, and pollen is their protein source. Next slide. And bees are also great pollinators because they have been genetically engineered to collect both the nectar and pollen. Next slide, please. Now, for those of us that suffer with allergies, pollen is not something we welcome, but for our bees, they welcome it with open legs, all 6 of them. Sorry. Next slide. And pollen grains are tiny, and they come in all different shapes and sizes. Next slide, please. And bees are actually covered in all of these hairs, and so each of those little pollen grains adhere to these hairs kind of like magnets. Next slide. And then once the bee is covered with pollen and their honey stomachs are full of nectar, they're going to fly back home and feed their young. Next slide. So pollination has huge economic and environmental impacts. Environmentally, it beautifies our world, and economically, it's all about food and agriculture. Next slide. So look at all of that beautiful, that beautiful fruits and vegetables and all those different colors. So when you go into the grocery store and you turn down that produce aisle and you see all of that different color, thank a pollinator, especially honeybees. Next slide. So here are our choices with bees. Next slide. And here are our choices without bees. And as you can see, a lot of produce disappears once our bees disappear. Next slide. So if bees were to go extinct tomorrow, would we as a human species starve? Next slide. Probably not, but our color would disappear and we would eat a lot of gruel. So things that are wind pollinated like corn and rice and barley, and not insect pollinated like our fruits and vegetables. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, you probably have heard not only honeybees, but all of our bees are in decline. Next slide. And it's just not our bees that are in decline, but all insects. Matter of fact, the May issue of National Geographic that I just got yesterday talks about how our insects are disappearing. Next slide. So remember when we would turn the lights on at night and we would see all of those insects? Well, they're not there anymore. What about when we would drive, the windshield or bumper effect, where we would have to stop and scrape off all the dead bodies because of all of the insects that had hit them? Next slide. Well, we're just not seeing that as much. And we're also seeing our birds, our songbirds are declining as well. Next slide. So why the decline? Well, loss of habitat due to agricultural and human development. There's not the food plants available for them to eat. There's not the areas for them to nest or shelter. Pesticide use is another huge reason why we're seeing the decline. Herbicide use, fungicide, insecticides, and then finally climate change, because it's throwing everything out of sync. Next slide. So what can we do to help the bees and the butterflies, or the birds and the bees? Next slide. Well, one, we can eliminate or reduce pesticide use. And Dr. Roberts is going to talk about this more in depth in just a minute. Next slide. But my favorite one is to plant native flowering trees, shrubs, annuals, and perennials. Next slide. We want to think vertical gardenings, vertical gardens, trees for bees. And there's a great a whole list of available native trees like red maples and red buds and tupelos, sourwoods. Next slide, please. Also, not only trees are great, but shrubs like blueberry and gallberry and blackberry and butterfly bush. Next slide. And of course, some of our wonderful favorites are our annuals and perennials. And one of my all-time favorites, Mexican sunflower and mountain mint. Next slide, please. And we can plant food plants instead of grass. I know that grass is a very lovely thing to see, but any homeowner or citizen has the capacity to make a significant contribution to conserving our pollinators by planting food plants. Next slide. So plant it and they will come. I want to thank you all. Next slide. And I'm going to turn this over to Becky. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.